Hi there, I'm Dr.McGregor from Institute of Urban Ecology, and I wanted to welcome you to today's online workshop about beneficial insects.
Here's some of those beneficial insects for you. There's some predatory insects and a parasitic insect there. And these are some of the animals we're going to learn about in this workshop today. And it's not just learning about insects, but learning about how these insects can benefit us with regards to management of pests in the urban garden. Before we get on to the rest of the workshop, I did want to let you know, if you didn't know already, that we operate the Soul Garden at the Coquitlam campus of Douglas College. That's the Sustainability Outreach and Learning Garden. And this is a place where we often have workshops to teach people things about sustainable garden practice, pest management, insects, and just urban ecology in general. So once we can have in-person workshops again, we'll probably operate workshops once a month at the Soul Garden.
So what we're going to do today in this presentation is learn a bit about pests and what pests are, why we have pests, and how an ecologist thinks about pests. We're going to learn about some methods in pest management that have been used over history, including pesticides, but also other sorts of approaches to pest management. And particularly, we're going to learn about biological pest control, which is a focus that I've had throughout my career, and some ways that homeowners can access this kind of technology in order to help manage their pests. We'll also talk a bit about the UNIBUG program, which is a program we've run at Douglas College for the last number of years. So let's start by talking a bit of ecology.
Well, just to give a little background before we get started here, I wanted us all to think about agriculture and the way an ecologist might think about agriculture. So you can see here that we would sit as humans as primary consumers if we're in a situation where we're eating plants, which is a large part of agricultural production across the planet. And we're in a position of secondary consumers if we're eating animals like cattle or chickens or that sort of thing, because we're one trophic level up. Now, I'm not going to talk any more about the animal agricultural aspect today, but I did want to point out that as primary consumers, we are sharing that role with a lot of other organisms on the planet. And that's why we have insect pests, because insect pests, a lot of them are primary consumers as well. They feed on plants, and when we plant plants in agriculture, we're sort of setting the table for the insects, if you like. They are our competition. So the approach for a long time has been, since about the Second World War, I guess, and up to the present day to some extent at least, is to use what we call chemical control to control these insect pests. We use pesticides like insecticides to control insects, but there's also other pesticides in the system that are herbicides to control weeds and fungicides to control fungal diseases. And there's been a few problems identified with this chemical approach to pest management. First of all, a lot of the insects started to evolve a resistance to these pesticide chemicals, and the chemicals became less and less effective over time. The second problem is that beneficial insects, like the insects that feed on pests, are killed by the pesticides probably at a higher rate than the plant-feeding insects themselves. The third thing, of course, is environmental contamination by these chemicals, and this is the phenomenon that was described in the famous book you see on the right, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson.
Well, that book by Rachel Carson was really important to a lot of people I know who got into careers to help do research and develop alternatives to chemical pesticides and synthetic chemical pesticides, whether it's development of less toxic chemicals or whether it's developing completely different technology. So we're going to talk about a few of those different pest management methods now.
Some of the other forms of pest management other than using pesticides include things like cultural controls, and cultural controls have been used probably since people started doing agricultural production. Other things where you manipulate the agricultural planting system in order to achieve some pest management, if you like. So by rotating crops between different areas, you can reduce the residual amount of pests that are in an area that affect a particular type of plant. By removing crop residues and sanitation procedures, you can remove some of the pests from the planting for the next round. And you can also time your planting and your harvests in order to avoid pests, if you know something about their life cycles and that sort of thing. Physical controls are also important, and probably many of you have gone out into the garden in the evening when it's getting dark and looked for cutworms crawling up on your plants in your garden to kind of remove them by hand. But this can be done at an industrial scale using large vacuum machines to suck, if you like, pests off of foliage in commercial agriculture. The one at the bottom is a technique developed by Dr. Bob Brennan at Agriculture Canada out in Agassiz, where he realized that by putting fences around the outside of certain kinds of fields, you could reduce pest damage because the insect pests involved, things like the carrot rust fly at a certain height, and when they're flying into your field and they bump into a fence, they simply can't get any farther in. So that's kind of an innovative method. There's also innovative methods using what are called semiochemicals, and semiochemicals are the information chemicals that insects use to communicate with each other, sometimes known as pheromones. Some of them are called pheromones. And this codling moth on the right, which is a major pest in apple production, the female codling moth will send a chemical into the air when she's ready to mate to attract males to mate with her. And people have harnessed this information about pheromones to develop a method called mating disruption. So if you see in the diagram below, in normal mate location, a female puts the pheromone out and a male flies to the female and mates with her. But if you put a number of dispensers with the pheromone into an apple tree, for instance, when the males fly into the tree, they can't actually locate the females, which shuts down the mating cycle and reduces pest damage dramatically. Okay, so here we've got a picture. You probably at least recognize the organism on the left. That's a ladybird beetle, or sometimes known as a ladybug, displaying its wings, which are usually hidden underneath its colorful wing covers. And on the right, we see a ladybird larva. These are both of these animals, the adult and the larva, are very voracious predators of small insects like aphids, and they make the basis of the pest management technique that's called biological control, which is what we're going to talk about next.
So biological control is a form of pest management, or a practice of pest management, that relies on using what we call the natural enemies of pest species to manage their population. So it's an ecologically based method, and it's a non-toxic ecological alternative to the use of chemical insecticides. It's occupied me for much of my career, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting too as we get into it. Let's start talking about some of the organisms involved to start with.
Well, one of the types of organisms that's very important in biological control are predatory insects, like the ones you see in these photos here. We have a brown lacewing on the left top, a ladybird beetle, which we talked about already, and a couple of ground beetles at the bottom. These are all voracious predators of insect pests. They feed on insect pests directly and cause their death that way, and as such they contribute to biological pest control. Here's another type of predator that you might not know about. The little fly on the left with the bee-like stripes on its abdomen is called a syrphid fly, or a hoverfly, and you might find these flies hovering around flowers in your garden, and they themselves are not predators, but when they lay eggs near a colony of aphids, the larva hatches, and you can see the larva on the right here. This maggoty-looking organism here is a syrphid larva, and the syrphid larva is a voracious predator of aphids. Another type of organism you probably haven't heard of is are parasitoids. Parasitoids are insects that parasitize other insects. On the left, you see one of the smallest insects on planet Earth. This is a trichogramma wasp laying its egg inside of a caterpillar egg. And what happens is its larvae hatch inside the caterpillar egg, feed on the contents of the egg, and then kill the caterpillar before it even hatches. Top right, you see an aphid parasitoid. So this is a small wasp, not quite as small as the trichogramma. It attacks and lays eggs inside of aphids, and its offspring develop inside of aphids, causing their death. Bottom right, you see the result of parasitism of a fairly large caterpillar. This caterpillar had, it looks like, dozens of larvae developing inside it, and when they finish their development, they pop out, spin cocoons on the outside of the caterpillar, and the adults emerge to go off and parasitize the next caterpillar. So these organisms are very important in biological pest control. One other type of organism is a disease-causing organism or pathogen of insects. Insects do get sick too, and we can harness these diseases to help manage our insect pests. Possibly the most famous disease organism in insect management is Bacillus thuringiensis, sometimes called BT, and it's available commercially as a couple of products, Dipel and Thuricide. And this is a product that can be used to manage caterpillar pests. In other words, the larvae of butterflies and moths that might attack our crop plants. You can buy it at the garden store, and you can see in the middle panel, here are a couple of larvae that have been infected with BT. Here's some BT cells in the other two photos. And this is the same product that organic growers use to manage their caterpillar pests in their farms. I did want to mention also Heterobditis bacteriophora. This is a nematode, very tiny microscopic worm that you can buy to manage European chafer beetles. You can use nematodes to control chafer beetles in your lawn if you have that as a problem.
Well, now that we've learned about some of the different kinds of organisms involved in biological control, let's talk a little bit about history, but also about the different methodologies that have been used. So biological control has a longish history and really got started in earnest in the 19th century with a technique called the classical method. But there's two other methods as well that I'll describe to you, and those would be the ones that are more applicable for use in the home garden.
The first method in biological control I'll talk about is called the classical approach, and this is something that we first started to do in the 19th century. So it's best to illustrate this one by giving an example, and I'll give you probably the most famous example of classical biological control. So in about 1868, cottony cushion scale, which you see in the photo on the right, was introduced into the United States from Australia and became a devastating pest of citrus production. There's huge economic impact by the 1880s, and it looked, for all intents and purposes, like producing citrus crops in California was not going to be possible anymore. So a program was unleashed where people went to Australia and discovered a couple of insects that were regulating populations of cottony cushion scale in Australia, brought them back to the United States and released them. There's two here, the Vidalia beetle and a parasitic fly called Cryptochetum. And those were released, and by 1888 or so, cottony cushion scale ceased to be a pest in the United States anymore. So this was a permanent, relatively inexpensive way to manage pests. And there's been lots of programs like this over the years, and they continue to this day. The second method is called augmentation or augmentative biological control. And again, I'll use an example to illustrate. On the right top panel, you see greenhouse whitefly, which is a global pest of indoor crops like greenhouse crops, that sort of thing. We see a whitefly adult here and a whitefly scale, which is the nymph or immature version of the whitefly. In about 1926, a parasitized scale was discovered in a greenhouse in England. And when they incubated that parasitized scale, what came out is this little wasp called Incarcia formosa that you see in the bottom panel down below. Tiny, tiny wasp that parasitizes these whitefly scales. And this particular wasp was produced commercially from the 1920s through the 1940s and used to manage greenhouse whitefly in greenhouses. So people would rear up large numbers of the wasp and release them into the greenhouses. Now, in 1949, with the release of products like DDT, these new chemical insecticides that were being used, commercial production went away for a while. But in 1967, it was revived by the Koppert Company in the Netherlands, and Koppert is now the largest company producing biological control products in the world. So there is, as I was implying, a biological control industry that exists. There's three companies here that operate in BC, Koppert Canada, BioBest Canada, subsidiary of a Belgian company, and our own homegrown British Columbia company, Applied Bionomics. All these companies mass produce predators and parasitoids for sale to farmers and homeowners. one of the things about this industry is that there's huge potential for expansion of this industry. A very small proportion of crop plants across planet Earth are protected using these kinds of products, and we could really increase the use of these products. And one of the areas that could be increased is the sales to the home market. Many of the sales of products like this are really just to commercial agriculture, although you can purchase some of these products now at some of your local garden stores. So keep asking, and you might see more of these products available in the future. The third method in biological control is called conservation biological control. And here what we're trying to do is modify the habitat in and around agricultural plantings or gardens in order to attract beneficial insects into the gardens. And certain plants seem to be very attractive and useful for some of these insects. At the bottom left you see sweet alyssum, which is a plant that's used in commercial agriculture in various places to attract beneficial insects. On the right you see yarrow, which is a plant that the Institute of Urban Ecology has done some research on in the past. Now, a few years ago, Institute of Urban Ecology ran a project called the Urban Bug Gardens program over at the Colony Farm Community Garden. And what we did there was we planted a crop plant, cabbage, and planted it in association either with other cabbage plants or with a number of different types of flowering plants, native flowering plants or ornamental plants. And the remarkable thing that we found is that we saw an increase in the number of predatory insects in the plots where we planted native flowering plants, things like yarrow and Douglas aster. So that program got us kind of excited, and we ended up establishing the UNIBUG project. So this is the User Network for Insect Biology in the Urban Garden. An exciting project we ran for a number of years, and it still runs in a somewhat different context today.
Well, at the height of the UNIBUG project, we had over 400 community volunteers who acted as citizen scientists in this program to help us gather information about the kinds of plants that would attract biological control insects into their gardens, and to help with pest management, of course. And people got pretty excited about the program, and they were excited about reducing pest damage, reducing the use of synthetic insecticides, but also in learning about the ecology of beneficial insects in their gardens. So here's some information about what we actually did in that part of the UNIBUG project.
So the idea of the research we did in a UNIBUG program is to screen different insectary plants that might be effective at attracting biological control insects into the garden. And by doing that, we would reduce the need for chemical pesticides in the garden. So you can see some of the plants that we might have used down below, yarrow and sweet alyssum, for instance. So all of the volunteers that worked in this program, this citizen science program, installed sticky card traps. You can see one here inside of a plastic bag after it's been used, and pitfall traps, which are just plastic beverage cups placed into the ground. The plastic beverage cups capture things like ground beetles, and the sticky cards capture some other types of predatory and parasitic insects. And our volunteers planted a couple of plants, sweet alyssum, Lobularia maritima, and yarrow, Achillea millefolium, in their garden areas, or they planted nothing because we're doing a scientific experiment here and collecting real data, so some people had to run control sites with no plants at all. And people learned how to identify the ground beetles that were in their cups, and they sent the data into us. These are predatory insects, again, that feed on pests. And here's some of the data. There's quite a bit of data that I'm not going to show you, but here's some good data from 2013 where we showed that the plant called sweet alyssum had a much higher number of ground beetles at locations where it was planted than at locations where yarrow was planted or where nothing was planted at all. So this suggests that alyssum is good at attracting these insects. And we saw similar work in 2013 and 14 where alyssum apparently attracted parasitoid insects as well into garden plots. So this is the good news. So just to wrap up this video, biological control in the home garden is something that you can do to reduce the pesticide load in your garden. If you're using pesticides now, it may be that you can convert to this kind of a system. So you can plant plants like sweet alyssum the same way that organic agricultural workers do in California to attract beneficial insects into your plantings. you can avoid using chemical insecticides because it actually these chemicals have a worse effect, if you like, on animals like parasitoids and predatory insects. You can release beneficial insects when they're available. You can check with your garden store and do releases in your garden if you like. And one of the side benefits of this whole program, the UNIBUG program, has been that people have been very excited to learn about the ecology of their gardens and learning about the beneficial insects that exist there. So before I go, I just wanted to acknowledge some of our funding sources and people that have supported us over the years.
Well, thanks for listening and learning a bit about beneficial insects today. I hope you found this presentation interesting, and I hope you found some things that you can use in your own garden. Make sure you stay in touch with the UNIBUG program and watch the videos that are posted on our YouTube channel. I'll see you next time with a video about ground beetles in urban forests.